It is a pleasure to be here, and I want to start by thanking the organizations that have funded the work I'm going to talk about, particularly the National Science Foundation, as well as Northwestern University and National Geographic, and also the numerous collaborators who have contributed to parts of the work I'm going to talk about today. You might notice, if you know who are alums of Augustana, that there's one of your alums right here, Anders Carlson, one of my collaborators, is a very successful quaternary geologist who comes out of the program here. And I think in some ways you can tell he has this liberal arts background. He has a really broad way of thinking about climate questions. So I thought that to acknowledge the breadth of liberal arts education, I would start with an image that is decidedly non-geologic, although I'm mostly going to talk about geology today. Does anyone want to guess what this is portraying?
Ocean temperatures, currents,
oceans. So all the colors are notably in the oceans. It is something going on in the oceans.
Shipping routes?
Shipping routes. Yeah, that's right. So it's actually, the colors are showing you the intensity of usage, the frequency of usage of different shipping routes around the world. Is my voice loud enough in the back? We good? Okay, thanks. And one thing you may notice about the Arctic is there's not a very intensive use of the Arctic Ocean for shipping. In fact, there's almost none today. But just a couple of years ago, literally, I think it was 2 years ago, the very first cargo ship made the trip from China to Western Europe this way through the Arctic Ocean over what's called the Northern Sea Route, rather than going the usual route to the south, which is longer and has some geopolitical complexity associated with it. So for the first time, a Chinese cargo ship traveled to European markets through the Arctic. And around that same time, I noticed this quote in a newspaper story, a prediction that shipping along the Arctic Northern Sea Route, that route I just talked about, could account for a quarter of cargo traffic between Europe and Asia by 2030. So guess in your head how many cargo ships travel between Asia and Europe in a given year. I have no idea what the number is, but I'm sure it's huge. And now imagine a quarter of those ships traveling through the Arctic Ocean, which up until a couple of years ago saw essentially no cargo shipping. And just think about what a profound change that is for people who live in the Arctic, for the economy of the Arctic, and the environment of the Arctic. So you are living in a time when you are going to witness, and you're already witnessing, profound change in the northernmost part of our planet. Why? Well, the human changes that I'm hinting at are driven by changes in the physical environment, and particularly the climate and the cryosphere, snow and ice in the Arctic. So I want to say a little bit about sea ice. How many of you have heard something about sea ice in the Arctic and trends in sea ice? So many of you are already familiar with what I'm going to say. But for those of you who aren't, this is showing you, in 2012, the extent of the Arctic sea ice pack in September. So the sea ice in the Arctic Ocean grows every winter, grows and grows and grows and grows until you get to around sometime in February or March, when the weather starts to warm up a bit and then starts to shrink back. And it shrinks and shrinks and shrinks until sometime in usually September, when winter comes to the Arctic and the ice starts to grow again. So it does this on an annual basis. And we pay a lot of attention to the area of the ice pack at that smallest point, at the very end of the summer when the ice starts to grow again for the year. And so that's what this is depicting in 2012, which is the smallest we've ever seen the Arctic sea ice get since we've been monitoring it by satellite, compared with this yellow line, which is the average of the past 30 years, the average smallest extent at the smallest point in the year. So that was a nice visual way to look at it. These are the data. So these numbers are showing you What is the area in millions of square kilometers of that ice pack when it reaches its smallest extent each year since the late 1970s? So this is as long as we've been able to monitor the whole ice pack because we have satellites looking down at it. And there's a pretty clear long-term trend, right? Lots of variation from year to year, which characterizes anything you look at in Earth's climate. There's always a lot of variation from year to year, but overall, pretty clear long-term trend. And in fact, if you sort of average in your mind what's the average minimum extent of sea ice in the last few years compared with the beginning of this record in the late 1970s and the early 80s, we're approaching an average it's approaching half of what it was. So again, a really profound change. It's unfolding over a remarkably short period of time. Does anybody know what this is an image of?
North Pole.
Why do you say that? Because we're talking about the Arctic Ocean. Whose flag is that?
Russia's.
It's Russia's flag. So this is the arm of a Russian submarine in 2007 planting the Russian flag right at the geographic North Pole under the ocean. Why would Russia do that? Mineral rights, basically, it's a move to say we're going to kind of stake a claim informally. We're going to say that we think we have a claim to whatever happens to end up being valuable about this part of our planet. And they're doing it in this decade, in 2007, because the Arctic is poised to become so much more strategically interesting and economically useful, because the potential to extract minerals and oil from beneath the Arctic seabed as the sea ice becomes less abundant, shipping rights, who gets to tax ships, who gets to have ports and other infrastructure along the way. There are a lot of economic questions that are going to open up in the Arctic. All of this, just my way to say that you almost don't have to look at the scientific data. You almost just have to look at what's happening geopolitically with the Arctic to see that the environment in the Arctic is changing, because world governments are responding to that already. But these are some of the data. And another point that I want to make about this data set is it only goes back a little more than 30 years. This data set is younger than I am. So this is not a long-term perspective. And all of you students who are learning to be physical scientists or geologists, geographers, when you see a graph like this, and I make the point that there's this big change happening, you should have a question in the back of your mind, which is, okay, but how unusual is that change really? If this record went back 300 years, would we just see sea ice extent doing this through time, and maybe sea ice being this small in summer is really nothing that unusual? Or is this extremely unusual? And it turns out that's a very hard question to answer for most systems around the Arctic, because it's not a place where we've been collecting data for very long, most types of data. So for the rest of my talk this evening, I want to talk about how I use lake mud to try to fill in some gaps in understanding, essentially to try to extend our knowledge of Arctic climate and environmental change back into the past as far as we can, to put recent trends in a longer-term context. So this is a nice lake sediment core from East Greenland. You can picture that tube, it's just a clear piece of basically sewer pipe. Picture that getting dropped into the bottom of the lake. This is the lake water, and this is the lake bottom. If you walked across the lake, that's the mud that your toes would sink down into. So that's the most recent mud. You can see layers going back in time. And lakes are remarkable archives of information about the environment. So if you think about a lake, or think about even it's called the slough here on campus, what's ending up in the slough on a daily basis? remains of plants, pollen from plants, fish remains, so plant and animal remains, chemical tracers of things that are happening in the environment. Maybe there's fertilizer used on the lawns here, and so you're going to see some weird nitrogen end up in the water. And ultimately, a lot of that ends up in sediments in the bottom of the lake. If you choose the right type of lake where there's active, constant sedimentation, stuff sinks to the bottom and stays there for a very long time. So my work mostly focuses on the use of lake sediments to reconstruct past environments. And I wanted to walk you through field work briefly. It usually starts with some form of uncomfortable transportation to take you up north. This is a relatively luxurious form of travel, actually. The National Science Foundation has arranged for some researchers in the Arctic and Antarctic to have military support for some of their work. And in this case, I've flown to Greenland on US Air Force C-130 that's actually equipped to land on an ice sheet. So it's equipped with skis, to land on skis, and it also has these propellers that have twice as many blades as normal to give it more thrust so that it can take off at high elevation from the surface of an ice sheet when the ice is 2 miles thick, and so therefore you're up at pretty high elevation. We use various modes of transportation to get to field sites. Helicopter is very common because we tend to travel with quite a bit of equipment. When you get to a site, you try to find a place to pitch your tent, and it's often a race to find the spot with the smallest boulders. We have a lot of different types of rafts and boats that we work from. I really like working from pontoon boats, so you can put equipment down the middle there. This is an example of a setup on that red cataract, where we have a little hole down the middle, so we can essentially, one way or another, send a pipe vertically down into the lake line. It's really pretty, the systems are really low tech. These are things that are designed to be collapsed into little boxes to go on a helicopter and then to be used by just sort of manpower of 2 or 3 people. So it's really low tech, but we try to be very, very careful to capture sediments intact so that we're capturing time intact. These are examples of sediment cores where just looking at the mud through this clear tubing, you can see that there's been an environmental change over the time it's recorded, right? So in this case, this is a lake that for part of its history had glaciers in its watershed. Glaciers that were sending silt-laden meltwater into a river that flowed into the lake. And so that's when you deposit this gray mud. When the glaciers go away, you no longer have that source of silt to the lake, and critters are happier, and you get more biological activity, more carbon-rich sediments, and you don't get that gray silt anymore. So really kind of obvious visual cues of a major environmental change. Here you can see there's also some visual evidence of environmental change, but often that's not really there. You see that the sediments are layered, and that tells you, good, we captured time intact. But overall, what you want to know might not be visually obvious when you look at the sediments, and instead we rely upon microscopic components of the sediment to tell us about past environments. So here, this is a pollen grain, a volcanic ash grain, some insect part that I'll talk about a little bit more later. This is a diatom. So lots of different things preserved in the sediments, as well as lots of chemical, physical, magnetic signatures of past environments. I have focused, since my PhD, primarily on biological indicators of past climate and past environment. So I just want to say a little bit about using biology to reconstruct past climate. In the simplest sense, we're really doing something that's very intuitive and that you all do to some extent when you travel around. And that is to associate certain species with an environment in which they live. And so when you see that species in a fossil record preserved in sediment, it tells you something about what the environment was. And a kind of clear-cut example might be if you were given a surprise vacation and put in a helicopter blindfolded and flown somewhere and dropped off, you took off your blindfold and you saw this bear, you would know immediately what type of environment you're in, right? Someplace with lots of snow and ice, probably not a lot of trees. In contrast, if you saw that bear, you'd have a different piece of information that you're in a different type of environment. So that is, in a qualitative way, what we do in sediment cores. Look to see what species were present in any layer of mud in the past, and make inferences about what that means in terms of environment. It's just another really clear-cut example. You obviously find this tree in a different type of environment than this tree, a different climate. Now, are there things other than temperature that determine which trees grow where? Absolutely. So it's complicated, inferring climate and environment from species. But you can also really not deny that species can give us important information about past environments if we choose species that live in specific environments that we know something about. So the indicator that I'm going to talk about the most today is an insect. It's a family of insects called chironomids, or non-biting midges. I wish they had a name that sounded a little bit less silly, because I always feel a little funny telling people I specialize in non-biting midges. But it's probably better than specializing in biting midges, because I'm often surrounded by swarms of them. And they're great indicators of past temperature, as it turns out, because it's a very diverse group of flies. And particularly in colder environments on Earth, when people have looked to see what seems to determine which species live where, temperature seems to be the biggest determinant. So we actually pick remains of these insects out of sediments by hand at a microscope. And this is the head of a larva, and that's what you really like to find, because it's very identifiable. And they're very abundant. In sediments from a lake in Greenland, it's not uncommon to find several hundred of these heads in a gram of lake sediment. So they're extremely abundant. When we look at this part, which is the mouth part of the larva, in more detail under a microscope, you'd start to see that the morphology is really different. So this one has an odd number of teeth, kind of 3 in the middle. This has an even number of teeth. So we actually spend a lot of time looking at the shape and relative sizes and patterns of their teeth to tell what types we have, and typically can identify these guys to the genus level, sometimes even a species type level, based on their morphology. So we have a fair amount of information about modern distribution of species. I think we can identify the same species in sediments when they're preserved there. And so we can make qualitative inferences about past environments just based on those two pieces of information combined. What we see species A, B, and C at this time in the past, and we know that in the modern environment, those species all live in the coldest high Arctic environments today. So it must have been cold at this time that we're looking at. And those qualitative inferences are really very powerful. But one of the things that is very unusual about this method is that it also allows us to reconstruct temperature in a quantitative way. Because we have enough species to work with, enough information about the environments they live in, that often we can get at temperature in degrees Celsius by combining what we know about modern species distribution and then what we know about changes in the abundance of different species over time at any given place in the lake mud. So we combine those two things with some statistics and try to get at paleotemperature in degrees Celsius. And there's really a very finite range of ways to get at temperature in a quantitative way like that. So as goofy as it sounds to study midges for a living, it's actually really useful, I think. To give you a quick sense for the power of this method to provide an indication of temperature, this is showing you the actual summer temperature at 66 lakes spread across northeastern North America. So they go from Maine all the way up to the high Arctic in Canada. These are the modern assemblages in those lakes. the modern assembrages are represented on this axis. So this is based on the insects we see in those lakes today. What temperature would we predict for those lakes versus what do we actually measure with a thermometer? And there's a very strong correlation. So this method in the right setting seems to be a really strong predictor of temperature. So I'm going to walk you quickly through 2 examples of using this method to try to answer specific questions. We're going to go to Baffin Island in Arctic Canada first to ask how unusual are recent changes at that site. We're going to look back 2,000 years to answer that question. And then I want to talk about ongoing work in Greenland, where my question is, how does the Greenland Ice Sheet respond to a warmer climate? I'll tell you more about the Greenland Ice Sheet and why I care about that a little bit later. But I will warn you that I don't really have all the answers to that question yet, because this is the second part is my work that's in progress. I've been working in Greenland for just the last few years, and that's kind of why I'm here, because I met these folks up in Northwest Greenland this past summer. Well, first to Baffin Island at 70 degrees north in the Canadian Arctic. So this is the town that we worked out of. This is in May, and this is the ocean right here. Yeah, so if you thought you were anxious for spring to come here, this is a place that is dominated by snow and ice almost the entire year. It's also very, very sparsely populated, so this is basically Main Street of the town of Clyde River. You're pretty much seeing most of town here. And our site is a lake that's about a 5-kilometer snowmobile ride from here. It's a site that has seen very little human activity through the years. So it's really remote from direct human influences, unlike, say, your slough here on campus, where you can kind of assume that this lake that we're studying in Baffin Island is going to record regional climate without the complication of a whole bunch of fertilizer being added to the water recently, or anything like that. So that's a plus of working in a really remote place. In some ways a drawback, but also a motivation for research, is that there have not been weather stations or thermometer in this town or anywhere near it for very long at all. So these towns were really kind of settled as towns during the Cold War. They gained airstrips at that time because it was strategic for the Canadian government to have more of a presence in its northern territories. And when they gained airstrips, they gained weather stations. And so weather records here date back to the 50s and 60s. So we have that much information, so it's really hard to know if there's a trend in 50 years of data, if it's what it means in a longer term context. So geologic data are very important up here. So here we are on the lake, and the lake ice is about 6 to 7 feet thick in May, so we have to auger down through lots of ice and then send a core tube down. This is actually the core I'm going to show data from today. We're subsectioning it in the field because when we want to look at time very precisely, rather than try to bring the whole core back on an airplane and trust United Airlines baggage handlers not to shake it up and mess up the record, we actually take little 1/4 centimeter slices off very carefully in the field and put them in bags and bring the core back that way. And you've seen this figure before, so you're actually, my little example of chironomid data was actually some of the data that lead to the temperature reconstruction I'm about to show you. So this is just the last 1,000 years though. So this is years AD going up to the time when we cored the lake in 2005. And these are the percentages of the assemblage that are made up of different niche taxa. So they all add up to 100. I think I'm only showing you a fraction of the taxa here, but if you saw them all, they'd add up to 100%. The relative abundances, in other words. And one thing I want to point out is this type here, Oliveridia, quite abundant throughout the record, but disappears at the very top. And then this type here is also present in most samples, but not present at the top. And then there are others that correspondingly increase at time. Well, it turns out that these two types are the two chironomid types that live only in the most extreme cold environments of our calibration data. So in the modern world, they live only in the coldest lakes. They're apparently not living at this site now, but they were for most of the time that is covered by this record. So those types turn out to drive a change in inferred temperature that's pretty dramatic, along with the shift across the whole assemblage that goes along with it. It's really the loss of those cold indicator types that are most important in terms of driving the temperature reconstruction that you see here. So now we're going through time in years AD up to 2005, over 2,000 years. There's some variation in temperature, maybe kind of long-term decline, but this is a pretty low-resolution record. Picking and counting these heads is a lot of work. So generally records are kind of low resolution, but we lose the cold indicators at the end, and the result is a temperature reconstruction that looks like this. So apparently, based on this record, big warming in the last 50 years. And we don't see temperatures that look like the recent temperatures anywhere else in this record. But we also haven't analyzed this at quite the same resolution that we have in the most recent time period. So I think this is quite a striking result, interesting. There's just one site and one type of proxy for past temperatures. So future geologists and geographers should be asking yourself, what about other sites around the Arctic? Do they show the same thing, or is this site kind of unusual? What if you use other methods? So I was fortunate to be part of a study in 2009 where a whole bunch of paleoclimatologists who work on recent records in the Arctic got together and asked themselves, what are all the published temperature reconstructions we can find for the Arctic that go back at least 2,000 years and have a certain amount of detail and resolution? So it turns out that my record, the one I just showed you, from that site on Baffin Island, didn't make the cut because it didn't have enough dots over time. It wasn't finally resolved enough. Well, that's fine. I get to be part of this other study anyway. And we did find, I think it was 23 records at that point in time. There's a few more now that were much more highly resolved, that covered that time period, and that were calibrated reconstructions of temperature. They came not just from lake sediments, but from ice cores and tree rings. So 3 very different archives of the past, and quite a few different proxies that tell us about past conditions. So these are layers in the lake sediment core, diatoms, and ice core, tree rings. Much more diverse study, and geographically quite broad as well. And so we took these 23-ish records and basically just averaged them. Put them on top of each other and averaged them. This is not a study with particularly fancy statistics. And so it's one thing I should say about it is that we don't have equal coverage in space, right? There's obviously a lot more data from here and here than from here or from Siberia, where we have almost no information, just 3 sites. So this composite reconstruction that we've developed doesn't represent space across the Arctic quite accurately, but it's just the average of these 23 records. However, they agree with one another remarkably well. The blue is all those reconstructions averaged. The red is weather station data for the Arctic as a whole. So an average measured temperature history for the Arctic as a whole over the time period for which we have that information. So the proxy data and the weather station data agree quite well. The proxies agree fairly well with one another. So the sort of standard deviation on this average is reasonably small. There's lots and lots of variability from decade to decade in here, but there overall is a fairly robust long-term trend through the record with really gradual cooling. And that's actually exactly what we expected to see, because the primary driver of climate change at high latitudes, particularly high northern latitudes, over thousands of years, is changes in Earth's orbit and tilt on its axis. So how many of you have heard of Milankovitch forcing? I see it. Oh. Yeah. So I'm talking about Milankovitch forcing, if you have heard that term. The shape of Earth's orbit, the tilt of our planet on its axis, these things change really gradually and predictably over time. They interact with one another, and all of that changes the way that the sun's radiation hits Earth. It has a profound effect on the amount of radiation received in the Arctic in summer. Because the tilt on our axis is what gives us seasons, and so as that changes, it changes the seasonality of Earth's climate. So that stuff changes gradually over thousands of years. And we know from astronomical calculations that the amount of radiation reaching the Arctic in summer has been gradually declining since about, well, certainly over the last 11,000 years. Okay, so we kind of expect the broad pattern of climate in the Arctic over the last 11,000 years to be gradually cooling. And we think we're seeing the last couple thousand years of that here. But then a change in the last century. So this is another way to look at the data. So the shape of this curve got a fair amount of media attention. The 20th century is clearly something unusual within this record. In fact, it's the warmest century of the record. But what I actually found most interesting in our paper was this plot, which shows you solar radiation reaching high northern latitudes in summer versus temperature for each century of that curve I just showed you. So the blue curve I just showed you, there's one dot on here for each century in that curve. Average temperature versus average solar radiation in summer. There's a really strong correlation, which is what we would predict. Centuries that had lower solar radiation in summer are also the colder centuries. Except that's where the 20th century falls on the plot. Lowest solar radiation, we know that. It's been declining over the last 11,000 years, but it's the warmest century in the record. So it seems quite clear that something else is going on in the 20th century in driving temperatures. So another geologic perspective, carbon dioxide. You know, it's been rising lately in the atmosphere. We know the long-term history of carbon dioxide abundance in the atmosphere from ice cores. Ice piled on year after year. It's really snow piled on year after year that eventually compresses into ice and core through this, just like we do with mud, and capture a year-to-year-to-year record of all sorts of things. And one of the things that's in that ice is bubbles that are just the air that was between snowflakes when they fell as snow. As the snow compresses into ice, that air gets trapped as bubbles. So you can stick a needle in here, draw out the air, and directly measure the composition of Earth's past atmosphere. So we've done that back 800,000 years in Antarctica. So now we have a really long time axis here, going back hundreds of thousands of years. Yellow is the recent rise in carbon dioxide that we've measured with scientific instruments. We've measured this directly in the atmosphere, a rise from here to here in about the last 50 years. And we're here at the star today. So when was the last time that we were up there at 400 parts per million? Not in the last 300,000 years. We can go all the way back through this 800,000 year record and not see anything that was remotely like today's abundance of carbon dioxide. There's, of course, lots of variation as Earth comes in and out of ice ages. No values anywhere near as high as today. So I am not alone in suggesting to you that this is the biggest driver, most likely, of the warming that we've seen in the Arctic over the last century. There are other things at play as well, but that's by far the biggest knob that's being turned. So that's what I want to say about the study on Baffin Island and then the synthesis that brought together data from across the Arctic. Now I want to tell you a little bit about my recent ongoing work in Greenland. I'm really excited about it. And I'm excited about it. This is Greenland. because most of Greenland is covered with ice. The Greenland Ice Sheet is about 2 miles thick at its center. It's a huge mass of ice. And if you were to take all that mass of ice and add it to the oceans, in other words, melt that ice sheet into the ocean, you'd add about 23 feet to global sea level, so all over the world. That's how much water is trapped in that immense ice sheet. It's dwarfed by the Antarctic ice sheet. So Antarctica is the only other place on our planet where we have a modern day ice sheet. And that ice sheet is roughly about 10 times bigger than the one in Greenland. So it's a monster. But this thing is huge too. And it has the potential to profoundly change what coastlines look like all around the world. Because we're stuck with this situation that water on our planet can either be on land or in the ocean. There's also some water in the atmosphere, but it's a relatively small amount and it's essentially in transit, moving around from place to place on land or between oceans and land. So any water that's removed from land ends up in the ocean, and that means sea level rise. So that's why we talk so much about glaciers and ice sheets shrinking and thus global sea level rise. This figure is showing you the history of global sea level over the last 300 years. And there's been a rise due to, and basically they're the things that can cause substantial global sea level rise, and therefore that have contributed to the recent rise, are warming of ocean water. So it expands as it gets warmer, so that adds to the volume of the oceans, and then melting of ice on land. This is the forecast for the future. So a range of future possibilities reported by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in their most recent report. A couple things I want to point out here. So the red versus blue are two different emission scenarios. So by far the biggest uncertainty when we try to project anything about future climate is, what are people going to do? What's going to happen with the greenhouse gases that are driving climate change? So that's a really big uncertainty, and that's the difference between red and blue here. And if you actually think about what the slopes of these lines are, if we're sort of here versus here by the end of this century, these are back of the envelope calculations they've done of the rate of sea level rise that we're looking at. Imagine that if that was the river out here. Which way is the river? I don't know if I'm playing the right direction. That way? That way? Seriously? Imagine if that river was rising a foot every 20 years. How would you build anything along the riverbank? The Radisson that I'm staying in the lead would have serious problems on its hands. A foot per 120 years, on the other hand, could be a lot easier to deal with. So it really matters to society where we end up on this diagram. The other source of uncertainty in here is uncertainty in the physical science, especially the physical science of how ice sheets behave. Because most of the water that we have trapped on land today is in the Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets. And it turns out that we really don't understand how ice sheets respond to a changing climate very well. If melting of ice was the only thing at play, we would probably have a decent handle on predicting how much shrinking of ice sheet you get for a given amount of warming. But it's not just a matter of melting ice into the sea. Ice sheets also flow. And so there are huge volumes of ice flowing into the oceans as well. So you can see both here in this diagram. And in this photo that I took from a helicopter over East Greenland, this is near the end of summer. So there's been a lot of surface melt on this outlet glacier. Relatively easy thing for a good physicist of ice to predict. There's still a lot of complexity, but you can get it roughly right, probably. How much melt do you get in a given temperature climate? But you can also tell this ice is flowing toward the sea. Here's another way to look at it from a satellite. You can see these rivers of ice flowing towards the sea, and they calve off icebergs. You can also see melt ponds here. So you can see both processes here. That flow part of it, the dynamic aspect of ice sheets, the fact that they flow, makes it really hard at this point for us to forecast what they'll do in a changing climate. Because they're just very complex, and we're getting better at it. But I'd say we're not there. And so the uncertainties in projecting future sea level rise are still quite large in terms of physical science uncertainties. So what I'm really interested in doing is trying to get a better handle on how ice sheets respond to a changing climate by going back to times in Earth's past when climate changed dramatically, especially when it was warmer than today, and asking the ice sheet, what did you do in that warmer climate? How fast did you shrink? Or when it got colder, how fast did you grow? And then asking lakes, what was the climate that drove those changes? So how much warming or cooling, and how much and how fast of an ice sheet response happened during climate change in the past. That's where I want to go with my research. And so the first study that I did in this direction was in West Greenland here by Jakobshavn, East Rye. Has anyone been here? Definitely go there if you ever have a chance. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's an amazing place. And Jakobshavn is one of the fastest flowing glaciers in the world. It has a very dynamic, documented history over the last century, being a much longer glacier. Not that long ago, it was shrinking back really rapidly. Its terminus is here now, and this is an iceberg-choked fjord that you're seeing here. So I worked with a team of glacial geologists, that's one of them up there, Nicholas Young, from the University of Buffalo, to work together to try to understand the history of the ice margin here through the Holocene, or the last 11,000 years since the last ice age, and to use lake sediments from the North Lake to try to understand how climate changed over the same time period. So just wrapping up with a few bits of data from this site. These are actually other data from elsewhere in Greenland, ice core and ice sheet based estimates of the temperature history of Greenland over the last 9,000 years. And one thing that might jump out to you about those three curves is that they don't actually look all that similar. They're all supposed to be temperature reconstructions for Greenland over the same time period. So this is problematic. Now, there are plenty of hypotheses about why they look different. We know, for example, that different proxies here record different seasons of the year, we're using different methods here, so there's some valid reasons why they could look different and all be correct. Or possibly they're not only recording temperature and there's other stuff going on. But regardless, I think that the variation between these records tells us that we need more information. These three curves aren't enough to really tell us what's going on with Greenland's temperature history through the Holocene. So that's my motivation for going there, recording lakes, and trying to get temperatures out of insects. So I have this record from North Lake, that star on the last map I showed you. These are just 3 different midge species from that core over time. And you can see that there's this time in the middle Holocene when a warm indicator was much more abundant, and then the cold indicators become more abundant in the second part of the Holocene. So just qualitatively, there's a temperature change recorded there. This is the quantitative temperature reconstruction that comes from that site. So using 3 different statistical methods and trying to kind of test the sensitivity of the reconstruction to different ways you can do the statistics to confirm that you get the same basic story regardless of which choices you make about the statistics. And you do get essentially the same story. So by working with glacial geologists, my goal is to ask, how did the ice sheet respond to these types of temperature change of this magnitude and that the rates that you see there. And this gets really complicated. I'm just going to walk you through it really quickly. The ice sheet history piece of this was the PhD project of Nicholas Young, whom I showed in that picture before. He's now a postdoc at Columbia. He's still working in Greenland. And he uses cosmogenic surface exposure dating to date moraine boulders and bedrock that's been scoured by glaciers. So he goes around looking for geomorphic evidence of past extents of the ice sheet and then dating them to say where the ice sheet was at different times. This, for example, is a moraine that indicates a past ice margin. So at some point this ton of ice was out here. He dated a bunch of stuff beyond it and found out that the ice was retreating towards this position about 10,000 years ago. So those ages are in thousands of years. So retreating. Prior to that, we were in an ice age. Chicago was under an ice sheet. And Greenland was most definitely under an ice sheet, a bigger one than it is today. So the ice was way out here somewhere in the ocean, and then it retreated back. I won't go into gory detail here, but if anybody wants to know more, we can come back to this. So I'll just really give you a very brief overview. One thing that we found is that there's evidence from this part of the ice margin that the ice advanced quite rapidly and briefly a couple times in the early Holocene. And those times happen to coincide with well-known cold snaps that are recorded in ice core records and some other records from around the Northern Hemisphere. So the ice sheet appears to be a quick responder, at least to cold snaps. And it appears that it was more or less in equilibrium with the climate in the early Holocene, because it was actually advancing in response to those cold snaps. There was previously a hypothesis that you come out of an ice age, and then it takes 10,000 years for the ice sheet to even just adjust to having come, the climate snapping out of an ice age, which would imply that everything we reconstruct about the ice sheet through the Holocene is just a slow response to something that happened 11,000 years ago. But instead, we see rapid response in the moment to what's happening with climate. So I think that's important. And then we see that the ice was out here at this moraine 8,000 years ago, and then we date stuff as close in as we can get to the modern ice margin, and that landscape is about 7,500 years old. So the ice had to retreat from out here all the way back to here in about 500 years, which is a really rapid rate of retreat. So that's another primary conclusion, that it can retreat quite rapidly when exposed to a climate this warm. How much warmer was this climate than the early part of the past century? 2 or 3 degrees Celsius. That's a warm enough climate to cause really rapid retreat of the ice margin. We'll skip some of that detail. And then I was also just really happy to see that the glacial geologic data indicate this is when the ice was smallest, and that's also when temperatures in my reconstruction were warmest. So that's just satisfying, right? So I was just talking about this area. I'm developing or have developed temperature reconstructions where all the stars are. So I'm trying to work my way around the ice sheet, not rely on one site, but really kind of get an integrated picture of what temperatures did through the Holocene as the ice sheet responded. That's a goal. And then take-home points. First of all, the Arctic is changing very rapidly today, and recent warming is highly unusual. When you look at the 2,000-year perspective, I showed you evidence for that. In fact, you can go back farther in time, and in terms of cause, it's very unusual, very far back in time. In fact, it's unprecedented in terms of cause. What's happening in the Arctic matters beyond the Arctic, especially if you live on a coastline. We have a luxury here, I guess it's a luxury, not living on an ocean coast, but you probably know people who do. I think we really need to understand ice sheets better. One way to do that is with paleo data. And a final thing that I want to emphasize is that there is a lot of uncertainty about exactly what climate will do in the future, exactly what ice sheets will do in response to that. But there's also a lot that we know. One thing we know is that if the composition of our atmosphere continues to change in the direction it has been changing, that will lead to overall warming. And the faster that happens, the more the impacts are felt, the harder they are to adjust to, the faster the impacts take place. And so I say that because so often I get the question, is it just too late? The Arctic's already changed so much, is it too late to stop climate change? And it is too late, I would say, to stop climate change because the train has already left the station. But the faster things change, the harder we make it on ourselves. And it's certainly not too late to slow down the rate of change. So that's my final point that I want to make. I just want to thank the many students and collaborators who helped out with this work. And thank you.
We have time for a few questions.
There was an item in the paper, I think, last week, that somebody had been studying soot from the northern climes over the past 200 or 300 years, and particularly as Europe industrialized. Does that have an effect that you could address?
So there's a lot of active research actually on the role that black carbon or soot particles might play in climate, well, both when they're in the atmosphere and then also when they rain out, especially on the snow or ice. And so I think that probably most climate scientists would agree that that soot did something climatically, but also that we probably don't know exactly what it was yet. There is a hypothesis out there that black carbon pollution played a significant role in some of the climate changes of the last couple hundred years, or especially in the northern hemisphere around Europe. So it's a piece of the puzzle, but I don't have a very satisfying answer for you. Does that get at what you want to hear?
What were your dating methods in your lake core sediments?
Good question. So every record I talked about, there's a lot of radiocarbon of discrete sort of macrofossils, usually plant macrofossils. And the work that looks at the 20th century in any detail also has lead-210 and sometimes cesium-137. So radioactive decay-based methods, and then cesium-137, for anybody who hasn't heard of this method, is basically just looking for a radioisotope that we sprinkled around the world when we tested nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. And so we can actually measure the abundance of this stuff in ice cores and sediment cores all around the world, and know that when we see a peak in it, that we're looking at the 1950s and 60s period of atmospheric testing, so that pins down time quite precisely in the last century. Does that answer your question?